Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. We are so excited for today's webinar with John Stoker. He's called in today from Utah and I'm in Michigan, and we are looking forward to a fantastic hour of learning together. As we're getting started, I want to draw your attention to your GoToWebinar dashboard. There's a question panel where you'll be able to, throughout the broadcast, post your questions for John, and also if you're interested in live tweeting today, we've posted that we're using the hashtag #OvercomingFakeTalk. So I would love to have you let me know where you're calling in from today. So check out that question panel, type in where you're calling in from, and I'll let folks know where you're from. I see already that we have a friend who's joining in from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome. And a friend in Florida, Ottawa, Ontario, Calgary, Canada. We've got an international audience today, John. Nebraska, Wisconsin. I don't know about all of you, but we're experiencing some fall-like weather here in Michigan. It was 55 degrees this morning. New Orleans, Louisiana, another caller from Michigan, a friend in Indiana, Oregon. I'm wondering, John, if we're going to hit all 50 states today. Virginia. Oh, my goodness. Calgary had snow. Can you believe it, John?
Wow.
Tell me about the weather where you are, John, and we're going to wait and see where everyone else is from.
Well, it's cooled down a little bit. The leaves are starting to turn. The peaches are out. I'm kind of excited about that. But it's supposed to go back up to 80 today, but it's been in the 60s.
Very nice. Well, I'm going to take a moment to introduce our guest today, but first I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Becky Robinson. I'm the founder and CEO of Weaving Influence, and my team and I have been so thrilled to support John and his great work. John has been facilitating workshops and speaking to audiences for over 20 years, and his aim is to help people improve their thinking and communication skills. He believes that the human capacity to achieve astonishing results depends on the individual's ability to interact with others. And so I know I'm very excited to learn from him today. John has a master's degree in organizational behavior and a JD degree. And our content today is focusing on his landmark book, Overcoming Fake Talk. So, John, I'm going to turn this session over to you. And toward the end of this session, we will also open it up for questions and answers. So please feel free to use your question panel, and I'll be back on with John at the end of our time together to address some of those questions. Thank you so much for being with us today, John.
You're welcome. Welcome, everybody. Before we jump in, I just want to say one thing, and that is I absolutely believe that these are skills that you can learn, that you can learn how to speak and think in such a way that will improve your results, that will create better relationships in your life, and that will create the kind of respect that not only you want to be on the receiving end, but also the respect that you want to give. Now, I'll tell you, I've done a lot of interviews this week, and one of the things that everybody seems to want to know is what is fake talk? So just quickly, I thought I would say, expose what it is and just say, fake talk is intentionally using untruths or unintentionally being vague and clear. I think that's the one I probably fall into most frequently. Sometimes people will just go along to be agreeable, or they'll focus and say what they think is politically correct. And sometimes they won't say anything. But in short, fake talk, if you will, is any conversation where you don't get the results that you wanted. In fact, we've all done that, haven't we? Be it with a child or a spouse or a companion or a direct report or a coworker or even our boss, where we think we've understood, we think we've been clear, and then we don't get what we wanted. So we don't find out till after the fact that things didn't go the way we wanted. So why don't our conversations work? You've all seen this illustration. It was drawn by Leonardo da Vinci centuries ago, and he referred to this as the Vitruvian Man. And what's interesting is the circle and the square are actually in the illustration. So the square for Da Vinci represents the science when considering the proportions of the human body, and the circle represents the human body as an art form. When I first saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, Da Vinci understood communication. And I thought, well, what's the square then? The square is what we say, and the circle is everything else that goes unsaid. Now, I assume that most of you are aware of the research of Albert Moravian out of UCLA, who years ago said that anytime a person is talking about their feelings or their attitudes, in a conversation, only 7% deals with the words, or if you want, I added the framework, the process for using those words. That encompasses the said. He then said that 93% of the conversation is the tone and the nonverbal behavior that we see. So, in short, the said are words, and the unsaid are the visual, vocal, and verbal aspects of every conversation that we hold. Now, in college years ago, they told us that there were words, right? There was the verbal and the visual and the vocal, but they never mentioned the mental. And yet the mental aspect of a conversation drives the other, all those other three. So here's what's interesting. As I thought about why conversations don't work, it seems to be because so many books or so much training deals with the said part, and they don't deal with the unsaid. So what does the unsaid include? All of this and more. It includes the assumptions that we hold about a person in a certain situation. It deals with the context. What's the situation and the past history? What's the intent? That's the purpose or the wants for holding a conversation. It deals with the presence of emotion, what we're feeling, or the feelings that are being displayed in the conversation. The tempo deals with how fast we speak. The energy has to deal with the energy that a person or even myself exude in the moment. The relationships or history would deal with all that past history, the status of a current relationship that I have with somebody. Nonverbals would include what? Facial expression, gesture, body movements. Tone, obviously, is the tenor of the words that we use, and the inflection deals with the emphasis we give certain words. And obviously the pauses serve to emphasize and provide spacing for a person to think. And then finally, the interaction style deals with the style which a person usually uses to hold a conversation. So when I started looking at all that, I thought, oh my gosh, there is more than just tone in nonverbals. There is so much more in conversation that isn't being dealt with. So quite frankly, I tried to write a book and create training that deals with all these aspects of holding what we call real conversations and avoiding fake talk. With that in mind, I just want to talk today about the barriers that most of us experience to communication. There are 7 of them, which we'll talk about, and I'll just briefly introduce each one, and then what we'll do is dive a little deeper on each of the 7 and then give you a little bit of a skill for helping you to improve. So perception deals with what? It has to do with how we kind of see the world, right? Awareness has to do with what we're seeing in the conversation. Emotion is huge because most people shy away or actually will run from emotion in conversation. Even at the hint there may be some emotion. Beginning deals with, well, how do we begin a difficult conversation? Most people don't begin very well, which means the conversation won't go very well. Understanding deals with how we ask questions and what we're trying to understand and what we're seeking to know. Skills and process we'll actually quickly review. The skills and the framework for holding any difficult conversation. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about listening and what we can do to improve that. So here we go. Let's jump into perception. This is what we call the process of perception, and notice it says perception is our interpretation of what we think reality is and how it works. So this little diagram is intended to portray and help us understand why we think the way we do. So you'll notice the little box over here on the right is labeled data pool. And in the data pool we put a tree, although recently I asked somebody what do you see in the pool and they said broccoli, which I thought was interesting. So here's this person. This person is making observations through the 5 senses of this event through this lens that in my field what we call your mental models. Now if you were a Covey fan, he would refer to this as your paradigm. I think the actual term in social psychology is a schema. But we all have a lens that we've been constructing since we were very young through which we make observations and view the world. This person, in observing this event, then engage in the process of selection. So when they see the event, what they see are a group of leaves. Then what happens is we take this selected piece of data, and I only put this lens in so I could say this, is that what we do is we add stuff that we like and we subtract stuff that we don't like as we take this selected piece of data and we place it where we think it fits in the puzzle of our thinking and make some interpretation about what it all means. Now you'll notice that there's some blank spots here. Those black or blank spots are intended to portray gaps in your thinking. So if you look at this gap right here, what this gap really signals is that these pieces of the puzzle don't fit. But we ignore that and make them fit anyway. For example, sometimes in a training class I might ask people, all right folks, I'm going to tell you every place that I've been. I want you to give me a one-word adjective that describes me. And so I'll say Southern California, and they'll say surfer or liberal. I'll say Utah, they'll say Mormon. I'll say Texas, they'll say cowboy. I'll say South Florida, and they'll say old or retired. I'll say Manhattan, New York, and they'll say arrogant. But the fact of the matter is that everybody from California isn't a surfer. Neither is every person from Texas a cowboy. But what we do is we ignore that, and if I say I'm from Texas, then obviously I'm a cowboy. Now you'll notice from our interpretation we next have this cloud around the person's head, and it's labeled emotion. That's because sometimes the way we think causes us to get emotional and sometimes not. You can see that the emotion is outside of the box in some places, and that's because some people, like myself, if I get emotional, you'll see it. But other people are very good at holding their feelings in, so they're not evident. From our emotion, we then either act or react. And our actions or our reactions are what creates our results, which goes back into the data pool. Now, if I made it really, really simple, here's what it would look like. Here's the lens, the person observing, and they select. What they see, hear, and think is internal. In other words, what that means is if I was talking to you, I can't see what you're selectively seeing, hearing, and thinking. But what I can see and experience externally is what you're feeling, what you're going to say, and what you're going to do. But one of the things we do know is that what we see, hear, and think is reflected in the way that feelings, words, and actions are displayed to our audience. So, perception is a barrier. Most of the time, folks, we don't see beyond our own mindset, or if you want, mental models, or our perception. So what happens to us is, one, we assume that we're understanding one another. Here's a great example. A couple of years ago, my oldest son was going to his first high school homecoming dance. You know, I just assumed that he knew what he was doing. And I think he just assumed, like most teenagers do, that he did too, until finally I just said, so how's it going? Getting ready for the dance. And he goes, great, man, great. I said, well, you mind if I ask you a few questions? He goes, sure, sure, sure. What? I said, so what color is her dress? And he says, well, why would I want to know that? I go, well, have you ordered a corsage? He said, what's that? I said, it's a flower. Usually when you go to a formal dance, a boy brings a flower for the girl, and they can either wear them on the top of their dress or on their wrist as a wristlet. He goes, you're kidding. And I said, no. He goes, what's that going to cost me? I said, oh, I don't know, anywhere from 20 to 30, 40 bucks. And he goes, oh my gosh. And I said, well, you know, do you have to rent a tux? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, if it says formal on the invitation, you usually have to rent a tux. And he goes, what is that going to cost? I go, anywhere from 150 to 300. His eyes are as big as pies. And I said to him, well, have you bought the tickets? He goes, what tickets? I said, usually to get into a formal dance, they're having a band. The school's got to pay for refreshments in the band, probably $25. And his mouth was just getting bigger. And I said, have you guys made a reservation? I assume you're going to dinner. And he goes, yeah, we're going to dinner, but why would I need a reservation? I said, because everybody in town's going to be going to the dance. If you don't make a reservation, you won't be able to get your party into any kind of a restaurant. How many in your party? He goes, 15. I said, Bryson, that's 30 people. Thank heaven I asked him, because I learned that my assumptions were incorrect, and he learned very quickly that what he thought he knew, he didn't. Another thing that kind of happens is our perception really leads us to assume negative outcomes. In fact, if I went back to the process of perception, I had a dear friend tell me this story last year. He'd saved up for 10 years for a yellow Corvette. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and on a summer's day, about a week after he bought that thing, he had the top down. It was a convertible, and he's just screaming on all the back roads over there in Tennessee, having a great time, music roaring, going about 80, 90 miles an hour on the back roads, and he comes around a corner, and he hears a little boy standing right by the side of the road. And the boy's kind of waving at him, and he waves at the boy, and as he goes past the boy chucks a rock, and it hits his windshield and spider fractures it. Immediately, he slams on the brake and turns the wheel and does a 180 as he's watching the boy run up the hill. He punches it, goes back to where the boy's running up the hill, turns off the car, jumps over the side of the door, and starts chasing him. Now, you can only imagine, right, what he's feeling. He's in a fit of rage. And what is he thinking? Probably something like that little brat, wait till I catch him. He gets to the top of the hill, the kid's going down the hill. He picks up the pace, he's running, almost out of breath. He just about is there, finally makes a jump and grabs the kid by the collar and pulls him down, pulls the kid up, and the kid says, thanks, mister, for following me. My little 3-year-old brother just fell down a well over here. I'm glad you stopped to help me. Obviously, he was totally disarmed. So what we do, right, without really having all the facts or data, is we assume the negative, or we assume the worst, without really realizing that we're doing it. The other thing is that we ought to realize is that our perception drives our behavior and creates our results. We don't often recognize it. Years ago, when I was first training, I had a boy come up to me on the second day, early in the morning of a 2-day class, and he said to me, were you mad at us yesterday about 4:30? I go, what do you mean? He says, well, you were asking a lot of questions and your brow was furrowed. You just looked like you were angry. Were you angry with us? And I go, no, I wasn't, not at all. I guess I'm high on thought, and I was just kind of thinking a little bit. And he said, well, I just kind of wondered, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but then what ended up happening is I got some feedback a short time later of the same thing, and I thought, wow, I cannot afford for people to interpret that I'm angry or upset, so I have to make a cognitive example in class to smile. Otherwise, I guess I just kind of have a blank look, and people interpret that as angry. And so, right, at least he had the guts, the student, to ask me and try to give me the feedback. Well, to make matters worse, here's what happens in terms of how our perception creates our results. Let's say in this situation we have Sue there. There she is, right? And Sue comes and approaches Jim. And Jim has a mental model of Sue. He has a tendency to see Sue as creating all kinds of drama. That's what he selects on when he sees Sue. So as she approaches him, right, he puts the drama queen crown on Sue. And he interprets, all right, here we go, a bunch more drama from the drama queen Sue. And that interpretation drives his feelings. So let's say his feeling is exasperation. That interpretation and feeling will then drive the way either he acts or reacts, probably reacts. And his reaction, which is observed by Sue, will elicit Sue's drama queenness to the point that she will play the role of the drama queen. But here's the other thing, it goes the other way too, right? So there's Jim, and she sees him, and what does she observe and select on? That Jim's not very smart. Actually, he's a little bit on the stupid side, right? So she takes that selected data and she puts it on his head, and she's thinking, okay, here we go. You know, Jim's got some stupid thing to say or ask me. And her feeling then, her emotion from that thought, has to deal with the fact that, you know, she's frustrated at having to take time to deal with him. So that interpretation and her feeling of frustration will drive her reaction, which will elicit, when he observes it, his dunciness, if you want, so that when she sees him, he plays the dunce. Now, what's a little scary about all this is it actually kind of suggests that in reality what happens is the way we perceive the world actually influences the way it shows up for us, right? So what do? If you want to improve your process of perception, there's a couple things you got to do. One, you got to stop and think. And you have to challenge the accuracy of your perceptions. Here's a story from the book. I'm sitting on a plane, actually next to a woman who is blind and has a seeing eye dog. And I find out in talking to her, I was flying from Dallas up to Seattle, and we stopped in Salt Lake, that she frequently made the run from Dallas to Seattle to visit family. So when we landed for a moment, the pilot came up to her and said, "May, how are you doing today?" And she said, "I'm fine." And he said to her, "Is there anything I can do for you, May?" She goes, "No, I take it we'll only be on the ground about 40 minutes. He says, "That's right. You know, anything you need, I'm going to get off the plane." And she says, "You know, I think Buddy," that was her seeing eye dog, "might like to stretch his legs a little bit, right? Would you take him for a little walk? Is that okay?" And he said, "Sure, I'd be happy to do that." And the pilot, you know, put on his hat, grabbed Buddy by the right hand, took out his sunglasses and put them on, and decided to exit the plane. I thought, I got to see this. So I followed him out. And sure enough, as soon as he came out of the gateway, everybody stopped and looked right at him. And a couple people go over and started to stand in line. And I listened in, and they're actually changing their flight because they thought the pilot was blind. So here's the thing. If you can surface your thinking, if you just stop to say to yourself, is what I'm thinking absolutely true? If there's one bit or iota of data that says that it's not, then you got to change your thinking because it's not accurate. So just note, just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. This happens at light speed, by the way. I would suggest that we check in on our thinking a little more often than we usually do. What's our second barrier? Awareness. We don't often recognize the dynamics that are present in a conversation. Why not? We just haven't been trained to recognize what's happening in the moment, which means that we don't pick up on the visual, verbal, or vocal cues that are being displayed. So years ago, I was coaching a senior executive who had a tendency to be quite volatile, and we're sitting in a meeting, and he's kind of upset with his team, and he starts to go after Jill, and he gets louder and louder, and I'm watching Jill, and she's looking down, and she's turning redder and redder, and then finally I just said to him, "Jim, can I interrupt you?" He goes, "Sure, what?" I go, "Look at Jill." He goes, "Yeah." I go, "What color is she?" He goes, "Well, she's red." And I said to him, "What do you think that means?" "She's angry." I said, "I don't know. Why don't you ask her?" So he asked her, and she exploded. I have never been spoken to in such a disrespectful, demeaning way. Now Jim was a good guy, He just had a tendency to be really quite passionate, and he didn't recognize the visual, verbal, and vocal cues that Jill was sending. And the challenge becomes tough because, you know, quite frankly, we just don't see ourselves the way that we're seen, which becomes part of the problem. In fact, I know a couple years ago I had a person in a training class who I'm talking along, and this guy blurts out, Winston Churchill. I'm going, what? And he just goes, Winston Churchill. I was disarmed. I didn't know what that meant or what I should do, and I just kind of kept talking, and he interrupted me and said, gosh, you're rude. I go, well, why am I rude? He says, well, I have a quote that I want to share with the class from Winston Churchill, and you just kind of kept talking. You know, and I apologized and said, well, go ahead. But, you know, I didn't know what somebody blurting out Winston Churchill actually meant. So here's the thing that you have to do to increase your awareness. And this is not easy, but we deal with this in our training. And in the book, we give you several skills. But you have to learn to be both an observer of what's happening in the conversation and a participant. A participant just means you're listening, you're interacting, you're thinking, but you also got to learn to watch what's going on. So sometimes what's happening is people will display a behavior and you won't know what they mean. So let's say I was sharing with someone an idea and they rolled their eyes and gave a huge sigh and leaned back in their chair. Well, I don't know what that means, so I'm going to ask. I might even say, I noticed you just rolled your eyes. Tell me what you're thinking. Or I'm wondering if you disagree with what I'm sharing. So that's what we do when we see behaviors we don't understand. We check out with questions what that behavior means, because we want to be absolutely clear what it is that we're observing and what it means. But if you're not looking for those cues, then you're going to miss them. And then oftentimes what happens is conversation will blow up before you even realize it was going to. Let's talk about the blowing up part. Let's talk about emotion as a barrier in conversation. Most people will avoid emotional reaction or defensiveness like the plague. Why? Well, oftentimes they don't see emotion coming. And then when they do, it's like they've been tossed a hot potato. They don't know how to manage it when it shows up. That means they may not even know how to manage their own. And some people are actually afraid in dealing with certain people that they'll become emotional as well. So a couple things about emotion we need to understand. When emotion appears in conversation, what we need to do is take time to accelerate through the emotion. Let me give you the analogy. I was talking with a senior executive one day, and he said, gosh, I wish my team understood that emotion was like driving a race car. And I said, well, how would you know about race cars? And he says, that's what I do for a hobby. I drive Formula One race cars. And I go, really? And he said, yeah. He says, let me ask you a question. If you were going 190 miles an hour and you came into a turn, what would you do? And I said, well, if it was 198 miles into the turn, I think I'd tap on the brakes a little bit. He said, wrong. If you did that, John, you'd flip the car and you might kill yourself. I go, really? So what would you do? He said, you push the pedal to the metal all the way down. It drives the car and the tires into the turn and actually increases your stability. I go, really? He said, emotion is the same way. If people could accelerate through the emotion, they could get to what's on the other side. Now you'll notice my second point. It says, discover the meaning hidden behind the emotion by asking questions. Here's the notion. Emotion is the mask of meaning. So when people get emotional in conversation, that emotion masks what's going on with them. Really, here's what I like to say. Emotion, and I'm talking hot or negative, is the symbol of a violated value. In other words, if I was talking with you and all of a sudden you got emotional or you got defensive, I would know that you were interpreting, thinking something that I was doing or saying personally, and that's where the emotion was coming from. So what I have to do when I see that emotion is not run from it, but try to understand it. And the way that I get to that is basically by asking questions for a number of different reasons. But if I said, I can see you're upset, tell me what's going on. Well, you know what's going on. Notice that's not really an answer to my question. No, I'm thinking I've done something that's offended you. What's going on? And then if they'll tell me, we're off to the races. Because the more questions I can get a person to ask, the greater the likelihood that their emotion will subside. And the reason is because a person cannot answer questions where they're emotional in their brain, which is in the amygdala or the reptilian brain. Asking them questions forces them out of their reptilian brain and into their higher brain. Which is actually their neocortex, which means the emotion will subside. So learning to understand emotions and how to diffuse them and get to what's behind them is a crucial skill for basically improving your conversations. Let's talk about beginning as a barrier. Most people struggle with beginning tough or difficult conversations. In fact, what they usually will do will lead with an interpretation. They might say, boy, you blew that presentation yesterday. Notice that's an interpretation. You blew that presentation yesterday. If I start that way, the person is already getting defensive. The challenge becomes that past experience will shape our current perception. So if I've dealt with a certain person and every time I try to give feedback they get defensive, I'm already thinking they're going to get defensive. And then because I don't know what's going to happen in the conversation, I get very nervous or uncomfortable, which means I start to speed up. And out of inexperience, like you just saw me do, sometimes when we begin the conversation, we literally will begin with blame or judgment, which is the last thing you want to do. So how do we begin? We create what we call an attention check. So notice the slide says focusing attention. What you want to do is take the time to focus the other person's attention. It would kind of be like this. If I called one of you today and you weren't there and I left this message, oh my gosh, you're not there. I needed to talk to you. Oh, it was so important. Okay, I'll try later. Click. If you heard that, what would you do? Most of you'd pick up the phone and you'd call me. And let's say I'm not there. So you wait a half hour. It's almost quitting time, but you call again and I'm still not there. And then what are you going to do? You're going to go home. If you had my cell phone, you'd probably try and call it after hours. Or maybe you'd even call me at home because you'd want to know what's so important meant. So notice how in doing that I focused your attention. Well, in conversation, what we do is two things to focus the attention of my listener. We focus the attention by sharing my intention. You identify your intention by just finishing the sentence. I'd like to talk about your presentation yesterday. Notice that's pretty neutral. And then I ask for permission to engage you. Can we do that? So that's what we call an attention check. I'd like to talk about your presentation yesterday. Can we do that? The gentleman that blurted out Winston Churchill in class, he could have said, John, I'd like to share a quote from Winston Churchill. Would now be a good time? If he had said that, I would have known totally what his intention was, what he wanted, and I would have said, absolutely, go for it. Rather than him just blurting out a couple times, Winston Churchill, Winston Churchill. But doing that helps you to know how to start the conversation. I'll illustrate this again when we put the whole conversation together. But attention check is a powerful way of starting a conversation. In fact, I like to say, you know what begins well ends well. So if I said to that person, I could even spin it positive rather than neutral. I'd like to talk about how I could really power up that presentation you made yesterday. Would you be interested? What are they going to say? No? Hardly. They're going to go, no, really, what? Tell me what I could do better. And we're off to the races. Okay? Let's talk about questions as a barrier. Notice this is not something that just happens naturally. Asking questions is a deliberate act that you do to what? Increase your understanding. Now, for the writing of my book, I actually did some research on why people don't ask questions. And here are the top 4, and I've since discovered another one. But when I asked people why they don't ask questions, here's what they said. Well, we think we already know the answer. We think we know what people are going to say. Well, we don't want to know. I thought that was interesting. And I go, why? They go, I just want people to do what I'm telling them to do. I don't know. I want to know. So we don't ask. This was an interesting one, the third one. We don't want to reveal what we don't know. So some people actually thought that if they asked questions for clarification, they'd look dumb or stupid for asking them, so they would rather not ask and not know and just guess or interpret what they thought the other person wanted or meant. And finally, we think we'll have to do something when we hear the answer. I thought that was very interesting. Ask a question and you create the expectation that someone will expect you to do something, and you don't want to do anything, so you don't ask. Since then, another one showed up when we did the survey last year. I don't want to take the time. Gosh, when I heard that, I was absolutely dumbfounded. Why wouldn't you take the time to see if you'd been understood and that they clearly interpreted what you were asking them to do? It was pretty shocking to me to identify that. So here's some things. Seeking to understand, you have to be able to take the time to ask good questions. Now, people will say to me, well, what's a good question? Or sometimes I'll just use the term the right question. A good question or the right question is a question you need the answer to. So notice what that creates. If you don't know what you want to know, then the questions you ask may not get you what you want to know or need. So interestingly enough, if I sit and think, gosh, in this situation I'm in, what do I need to know? If I just took a moment to ask that of myself, it would help me to identify what questions I needed to ask that would help me to learn what I know. The other thing that you do when you ask questions, particularly if you're clarifying, is you're demonstrating that you really have care and concern for the individual because you took the time to ask. And personally, I like to say that the easiest way to create respect is by asking a question. In fact, years ago at a manufacturing plant, we taught real conversation skills, gosh, for a year, and then we decided to let it go for about 6 months, and we went away, and then we came back to see what was going on. And on the first day, I walked out onto the plant floor, and I walked around, and I started talking to some people. And I asked this one guy, I said, tell me, how's it going? And he said, well, let me tell you what happened today. My boss asked me what I thought. And I told him, and he said, next time I'll ask an expert. I go, oh my gosh. And then I asked another person, and then she said, well, I asked my boss, something, and then she asked me a question back, and as I was answering her question, she walked off and left me talking to myself. So here's the deal. If you don't want to know, don't ask, because asking questions goes a long way to creating respect. It kind of creates the assumption that you really want to know and you want to hear the answer, and it also implies that you're going to listen. So if you're not going to listen and you really don't want to know, then don't ask. Don't ask. What's our next barrier? Yay, skills and process for holding a conversation. Here's what I've kind of noted in the last couple of years. I think, folks, that we have been socialized to assume that sarcasm, yelling, and screaming and withdrawing are the preferred conversational skills of the day. Maybe it's from all the different programs on TV. I mean, even watch some of the cartoons my kids watch, right, where the kids in the cartoon will treat their parents in a very demeaning way. I've just wondered why we see so much of these kind of behaviors. It's almost like communication has kind of become a bombing run where people fly in, dump the bomb, and fly off. And so what's important is that we know the skills of good conversation, or what we call real conversation, and the process for using them. In fact, last week I took my daughter to Cinemark to watch a movie, and there was an older couple, probably in their 80s, standing in line in front of us, and they were with their daughter who was in their 20s, and I guess the older couple didn't buy senior citizen tickets, they just bought regular tickets, and they were coming away, and I couldn't believe how their daughter was speaking to them. Mom, you paid too much. What were you thinking? You weren't thinking, Mom. You weren't thinking at all. Go back and get your money back. And they just started a huge argument in front of everybody, and I just thought, wow, that kind of an argument over $2? But that seems to be what's going on these days. So I found that people seem to lack a knowledge of the skills and a process for talking about what matters most. Now, I know that this is only 7% of the conversation, but let me just expose you quickly to the skills and the process. So here are the skills. We call them the real skills. And the R stands for recognize and suspend. You have to be able to recognize your thinking and suspend it. If you wanted to make it easy, just call it being open. Expressing is what I'm doing right now. It's sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your experience, your feelings. The challenge with expressing is to do it in such a way that it doesn't create defensiveness in your listener. Asking is about asking questions. And listening and attending, I divided them because listening is what we do with our ears, and attending is what we do with the rest of us, with our body, with our eyes, with our intuition, with our thinking. So those are the skills that we use. Those are the skills that the book dives in detail on, and the skills that we teach in our training class. So how do you use them? Here is the process for holding any difficult conversation. I should have put in a couple more slides, so let me explain each one, and then, I'll craft a conversation so you can see how it's used. Initiation is doing nothing more than beginning the conversation. And in initiation, we use an attention check to get the attention of our listener, and we share facts and our thinking. In discovery, we just ask questions. We ask questions to confirm our thinking and questions to learn. If I make it simple, in connection, we just summarize what we've heard and understood, whether it be where we agree or disagree. And in building, we actually come up with a plan for what we're going to do differently. And by the way, isn't that the reason we're holding a tough or difficult conversation and avoiding fake talk? We want something to come out of it. And then we gain commitment to that plan. So here's what it might sound like. Let's make up a story. George and Sally, all right, been married a couple years, have a couple children. George travels a lot for business. He comes home late on a Friday night. He's hugging Sally. He looks around and he goes, wow, this place is a dump. Sally goes off. I'm sick of you criticizing me. And she bolts upstairs. Well, George feels terrible, right? He thought, well, I'm not going to go up there. I'll catch it again. I'll just wait down here. So as he decides to wait, what does he do? He picks things up, he vacuums, he takes out the trash, and he sits on the sofa and he waits. Finally, she comes down. Here's how he initiates. I'd like to talk about what just happened. Could we do that? I guess, she says. Well, here come the facts. I made a comment and you got upset and left. Here comes the thinking. I'm thinking that, this may have been building for some time, and you thought that you couldn't bring it up. You see how that's his interpretation of the event? Now he's going to go to discovery. What's going on? And she's going to go, you know what? You always criticize me for how the house looks, and I'm sick of it. And if he's smart, he's going to apologize. Gosh, I'm sorry. But, you know, when I make such comments, do you ever notice what I usually do? So he's in discovery, right? And she's thinking, and she says, well, just now you cleaned it up. Do you think you could accept that when I say such things, maybe I'm just thinking out loud and those comments are not a criticism of you? Well, I guess, but you know, I have a hard time with your thinking out loud, as she says it. Well, I can understand that, you know, so why didn't you tell me? Well, you worked so hard, I just didn't feel like I wanted to lay one more thing on you. Okay, now he's going to go to connect. So, you know, I know you like the house clean because you pick it up, and I like it clean too. But at the same time, it sounds like the way I think out loud really irritates you. Is that right? Yeah. So now let's go to build. So, gosh, Sal, what do you think we ought to do? Well, you could begin by quit making comments about the house. Okay, I get that. And you know what? What I'd like is when you're upset with me, rather than holding it in, you create an opportunity to talk to me about it. If you can't do it in the moment because you're upset, if you just promise that you do it in the next 24 hours within a time when I do something, that would be very helpful. Then he's going to gain commitment. Can we do that? Sure. So you'll commit to bring it up if I upset you, and I'll commit to quit making comments about the house look. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. So there it is. We initiate, we discover, we connect, and we build. That's the process for holding any difficult conversation. So you know what? You got to have the tools and know how to use them. It's almost like when you build a conversation, you're building a house. You want to build a house, what do you got? You got the resources, the wood, the nails, the concrete. You've got the tools, right? And you have to have the blueprint. Initiate, discover, connect, and build becomes our blueprint. The tools are the real skills, right? And obviously the resources, the content, is the situation itself. Last barrier. People don't listen. The research that we did on that says here are the top 3. We usually don't listen because, once again, we know what the person's going to say, or we're thinking about what we want to say next, or we're preoccupied with that little voice in our head that is judging, analyzing, editorializing, or commenting on everything that the other person is saying. I've even had somebody say to me this week in an interview, you know, I listen from the perspective of my own agenda, or I listen to see if I agree or disagree with the person, or I listen just to render judgment. So notice, if you're listening and that's the stuff that you're doing, you are not hearing everything that they're saying, nor are you attending or noticing the other messages that people are sending. Now, why is that important? Because the research says we can process at about 850 words a minute, but we can only talk at about 150 words a minute. So where do you think that other 700 words a minute comes out? It comes out in what we do with our hands and our body and our eyes and our tempo and our pauses and our word inflection, all that. So if you're self-absorbed, you can't catch what's going on. So what do you got to do? To be a better listener, you need to be present and manage your listening, which basically says if you can't be present, you'd be better off to postpone the meeting. You've got to be patient. It takes time to listen to somebody. Again, if you're preoccupied with that meeting that's coming up in 5 minutes, you're better off to say, I got a meeting, it's in 5 minutes, I'm wondering if we could talk, you know, around 4 o'clock. Could we do that? Just manage it. Be attentive, not only to what the person is saying, but what they're not saying and everything else they may be sending in terms of a message. And then be proactive. If you see things that they're doing or you're feeling things that, you know, maybe you're thinking they don't understand, the only way you'll know is by asking questions. But good listening is not something that you can do. All right, you can't fake it till you make it. You're either doing it or not. So quickly, what'll it take? You got to learn to challenge your perceptions to see if they're accurate or not. You got to be able to increase your awareness of what's going on in the moment. If you can't see it, you can't manage it. You got to manage emotion by recognizing it and getting to what's on the other side by asking questions. You got to begin well. You got to learn how to use an attention check to get the attention of the person and start the conversation. You want to make sure you ask questions to understand, to clarify, to see if you're on the same page, to initiate thinking. It creates real conversation, which is dialogue. You want to internalize the skills and the process. By the way, I didn't say this, but one of the great things about the process, it always allows you to know how to start the conversation, where you are at any point in time during the conversation, and when you're done. Finally, you got to listen and attend to what's going on, and you got to practice, practice, practice. That's the stuff you got to do. Becky, do you want me to answer some questions in the time we have left? Are you there? Hello. See if there are any typed in. I cannot see any questions, and everybody is muted.
Sorry, John. It took me a second to unmute myself. Sorry about that, John. I'm back with you. I've just been so intensely listening that I forgot how to unmute myself. I want to welcome everyone to please use the question panel now and share some questions with John. I know my mind is spinning, and I'm going to ask a question to feed the questions while we're waiting for some. And then I see some coming in. So, John, I'm curious what role courage has as it relates to fake talk. And sometimes I'll find myself in a situation and I know I'm fake talking, but I'm not really sure that I have the courage to overcome that. So wondering if you have any tips on that.
Yep, I do. So yesterday in an interview I did, somebody asked me if there was one thing I wanted to get out of the book, what would it be? And I said, well, aside from all the skills, I would hope that people would gain hope and confidence or courage that they could talk about what really matters. And so for me, that's a big part of it. I think if a person doesn't have a blueprint, they don't know the process, and they don't feel like they have any skills, then they're afraid and they don't want to speak up. The other thing that basically helps people to speak up is knowing what they want from the conversation and doing a little thinking or preparation about that person and the situation and what they want for the conversation. If they'll just follow the process and do a little prep, I like to see prepare or beware, then they can, have fantastic results in the conversations that you hold. But outside no skills, outside no process, sure, people are afraid, and it takes courage.
Great. Thanks, John. So there are a few questions that have come in, and I'm open for more. Our friend Chantal would like to know if we have any tips for dealing with a coworker who only wants to communicate by email. And that question is interesting to me, especially since I run a virtual team and there's a lot of email communication. So wondering if you can speak into email communication.
Okay, so first thing I would say is that you have to determine if the conversation is difficult or not. If it is, I would not hold it in email, because if we do the 93-7 rule, notice you're only getting 7% of the conversation because you're getting the words only, and you're missing nonverbal behavior and tone and cadence, and you're missing all of it, which means you may interpret negatively or make up the other 93%. So for her situation, I would go back to the person and set a ground rule. If this is a tough conversation you need to have, I would do it on the phone. At least you can hear the sighs, the pauses, the cadence, and the like. Or I'd do a teleconference on Skype, or I'd get in the person's personal space. I'd get there together. And you know what? These younger people, I've got a few people between the ages of 21 and about 28 that work for me. They want to do everything on texting and via email. And it just doesn't work. And I'm the kind of guy that types quite slowly, so I just did it yesterday. Call me, somebody who helped me do these slides for today. And I said, here's what I need. Got a pencil? And she goes, yeah, let me type it in. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. things I just went through very quickly, and she took notes and did it. And I don't want to have to type those out and send them to her. And so I would just say assess the kind of conversation that it is, and then decide how you're going to hold it and have an agreement about how you're going to hold it.
Got it. Thanks so much. So, John, do you think these skills work when the person you're talking to is really not interested in communicating? Karen is saying she thinks that they might still be effective even if the other person is not participating in the way that we'd like. Could you speak to that?
I can't force the other person to talk to me. I mean, we're short of pulling a gun out, which you don't do these days. But I can increase the likelihood. That's a common thing that people will say in training. They'll say, well, Pete, this works great if everybody's had the training. And I like to say, no. If you know what you want from the conversation and you have the skills and you know the process, then you can manage the conversation. It doesn't matter that the other person doesn't have the same skills as you or knows the process. You can use them managing your boss upward or laterally with a coworker or downward. Hey, we need to talk about something that's not working. Can we talk? Sure. Well, what's going on? Well, gosh, yesterday you said you'd get me that thing by 3 and I didn't get it till 4, and then I had to call Becky and tell her I couldn't get it for an hour, and I'm thinking that you may not have known that I needed to visit with Becky. Tell me what happened. And so notice I just initiated right there and then went immediately to discovery, and we asked tons of questions. I summarized, then we come up with a plan for building it. So I would absolutely say if you have the skills, you can manage the conversation, and it doesn't matter whether they have them or not. Does that help?
It does help. I was thinking of this when you were talking before, John, about the power of questions. Is there one question more than another that you think is the most powerful for starting conversations?
Oh, for starting a conversation?
Sure.
I still use my attention check. I might say, Becky, I really need your help. Can we talk? Now, I can talk to people I don't even know in audiences where I speak, and I could say that, and immediately they'd be focused up, and they'd say, sure. Do we need to talk here, or do you want to go outside the room?
Yeah.
or right, because I'm drawing them in with something. Or I could even say, I got a challenge. I need help. Can we visit? And people will give you their attention. And that's what you want when you want to begin a conversation. You want the other person to be engaged with you.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we're running out of time. I have a couple more questions I'm going to ask you in this last minute. One, John, is that we have some folks who are wondering if we're going to make this slide deck presentation available. We will be posting this recording on YouTube, and we'll be sharing some follow-up via email, but wondering if you're willing to share the slide deck or if it will be on SlideShare or anything like that, John.
I would have to say to you, you tell me how you want to do it. If I can create it into a deck that they can gain access to, I don't mind that. If they'll give us their email,
okay,
and so we can share that. And then if it's all right, I'll put their email in our database so they're getting our weekly newsletter tips and stuff that goes out. If that's cool.
Sure. So I can share more details about that when I send the follow-up from this event. And let's just take one more question as we close. Well, there are a couple. Maybe you can write some blog posts in answering these. But I'm going to ask this one that came in from Stefan, wondering about what this whole process looks like in teaching these skills to organizations and what the impact and timing is like.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so that's typically a 2-day class. There are 8 principles. In the training, we teach 4 awareness principles in the first day, which is awareness, knowledge, the reflection principle, and the preparation principle. In the second day, we teach a number of in-depth skills. So we'll teach skills for recognize and suspend, skills for express and ask, skills for ask, and skills for listen and attend. That's the kind of the timing and the skills. There are a number of companies that have been using these skills for a long time, like Cox Communications, Lockheed Martin, Sonic Automotive, Nebraska Furniture Mart, and what they do is they use this training in their organization to teach people how to hold a difficult conversation, with the intent being of people learning from each other and being more effective and gaining the capacity to get the results they really want while building relationships and creating respect.
Fantastic. Well, John, I thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and energy and expertise with us today. And for everyone who's still listening, we'll be in touch soon with recordings and follow-up material so that you can continue to learn from John. I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to go to Amazon today and pick up John's book, Overcoming Fake Talk. You can also visit Overcoming Fake Talk. I can't talk. You can visit overcomingfaketalk.com, and we have some great, easy-to-share resources and quotes from the book. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, John.
Bye-bye.